Africa will no longer let others decide the price of its own blood and soil. That single sentence did not come from a stage, a rally, or a speech written for applause. It came from a closed-door meeting where silence was expected. Compliance was assumed, and signatures were supposed to follow without resistance. But Ibrahim Traoré did not sign. The proposal placed in front of him looked official, polished, and harmless to anyone unfamiliar with its purpose. It outlined the continuation of standard international pricing mechanisms for Burkina Faso's gold exports. What that really meant was simple. Africa would keep mining the gold, and someone else would keep deciding its value. The document referenced international benchmarks and recognized valuation systems, code words for the London's Bullion Market Association, and the pricing structures controlled in cities, thousands of miles from the mines of the Sahel. The terms were not presented as negotiable. They were written as expectation. The negotiators who delivered it did not anticipate debate. They believed their language. The same wording used across decades of foreign agreements was enough to secure obedience. They thought Traoré would do what previous leaders had done: delay, accept, adjust, or stay silent. Instead, he refused, immediately, without edits or bargaining. There was no need for debate when the intent was already clear. The value of African resources was still being set outside Africa, with justification crafted in financial institutions that had never touched West African soil. His refusal wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. But what happened next was not just the reaction in that room. It was the chain of events it activated across continents. Because when one leader openly rejects the system that prices his nation's gold in someone else's market, the threat to that system is not symbolic. It is structural. That rejection didn't just cut into a contract. It tore into a hidden economy no one was meant to challenge. And here is where most people misunderstand the story. Traoré's response was not emotional. It was calculated. For months before that meeting, confidential reports had surfaced inside Burkina Faso's Ministry of Mines. They detailed how gold was being priced before export, not by Burkinabe officials, but by foreign valuation channels that assigned rates far below actual global prices. Shipments left African soil labeled with figures designed to favor the buyer. By the time the gold reached European vaults, the declared value had already been manipulated at origin. The profits didn't disappear during transit. They disappeared on paper, and that was the real objective of the proposal he rejected: to keep the system running without questions. What the negotiators didn't see was that the silence that protected their system had already been broken. When Traoré pushed the document away, he wasn't just denying permission. He was signaling something far more dangerous to the institutions that wrote it. We know how the game works now, but what none of them expected was that his rejection was only the beginning. Because within weeks, something surfaced that was never meant to be found. A file with no author, no official seal, and no traceable origin, but with details precise enough to expose everything that had remained in the shadows. And that is the moment the story stopped being about refusal and started becoming an exposé. The system wasn't afraid of anger. It wasn't afraid of criticism. It was afraid of evidence. And that's exactly what arrived. That document exposed the real pipeline of Africa's gold, not the one written in trade agreements, but the one hidden in valuation codes, offshore documents, and silent partnerships. Inside that file were 1. Names of foreign brokers who bought gold at suppressed pre-export prices. 2. Records of banks that processed the transfers through discount clauses. 3. Listings of development agreements, disguising extraction deals. 4. References to offshore accounts where the real profits were recorded. 5. Internal memos showing how the system was designed to look legal. And then there were the numbers. Side-by-side tables compared the official global price of gold to the amount declared when leaving African soil. In some cases, the difference wasn't a rounding error. It was a theft in plain sight. Gold worth $100 million could be recorded as $58 million before it even left the port. The missing $42 million didn't vanish at sea. It vanished on paper, long before Africa ever saw the value. The file also traced export routes through European ports, where gold shipments were secretly reclassified. A discount applied at origin became market fluctuation on arrival. And once it entered the foreign refinery system, the profit gap was quietly absorbed into private accounts and institutional margins. Burkina Faso was not the only victim. Mali, Niger, Guinea, Tanzania, Ghana, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Every one of them appeared in the leaked charts. Different governments, different contracts, same manipulation. But the most chilling sentence in the document was a single line buried in the middle. Export valuation shall remain externally determined until domestic pricing capability is rendered non-viable. Read that again. They didn't say Africa lacked the capacity. They said Africa's capacity would be made non-viable. For decades, African nations hadn't failed to create gold pricing systems. They had been prevented from doing so by a design that hid behind words like stability, standards, and international visibility. When Traoré read the file, he reportedly placed it back on the table and said one sentence: "They never feared our silence. They feared the day we could prove it." Notice something. Not a single headline mentioned gold pricing theft. Not a single one questioned the foreign-controlled valuation system. Not one outlet asked why Africa's gold was being priced in London and Zurich instead of Ouagadougou or Bamako. The goal of the narrative was not to expose truth. It was to bury it. And they weren't just targeting Burkina Faso. Mali, Niger, and Guinea, countries already distancing themselves from French and IMF control, suddenly faced a surge of reports warning about economic uncertainty, undocumented export shifts, and unverified resource reforms. NGOs that had been silent on exploitation for decades suddenly rediscovered their voices, releasing statements about the dangers of centralized mineral control, concerns over transparency in gold management, the risks of resource nationalism, and while the narrative war was failing to contain the truth, something far more alarming to the system was unfolding. Burkina Faso was no longer focused on resistance. It was focused on replacement. The question was no longer, will Traoré accept the old terms? The question had become, how soon can a new system be built without them? And that was the moment the people who ran the old pricing network realized something critical. If they didn't stop Burkina Faso now, they might never stop anyone else again. When the narrative strategy failed to control the damage, the next phase unfolded quietly. Not through headlines, but through calculated disruption. Pressure moved from microphones to corridors. Officials in Ouagadougou began receiving private offers, framed as friendly cooperation, access to new development loans. If pricing policy stayed unchanged, security partnerships. If mining regulations remained aligned with current frameworks, foreign investment guarantees. If export valuation continued under global standards, but none of it worked. What they underestimated was this: Traoré wasn't improvising. He wasn't reacting. He was executing a plan that didn't begin with refusal. It began with replacement. And the first step of that replacement was already underway: a domestic gold refinery on Burkinabe soil, pricing control shifting away from London and European banks, a plan to unite Sahel states under a shared resource valuation system. The move wasn't symbolic. It was structural. And that's exactly when interference escalated. Communications between West African financial offices and their international counterparts began experiencing unexplained delays. Requests for equipment needed to advance. Refinery development were suddenly slowed at shipping ports. Foreign consultants, embedded in economic ministries, returned with unusual urgency to their embassies. And then came the warnings, dressed as advice. Avoid rapid structural shifts. Gold valuation is too sensitive to nationalize abruptly. Investors may interpret autonomy as instability. Consider hybrid pricing models to ease the transition. The file was never meant to go public. And it didn't have to. All it had to do was reach the right desks in Ouagadougou and the wrong rooms in Europe. It didn't take long. Within 48 hours of internal circulation, quiet alerts began moving through diplomatic and financial networks. Nobody said Traoré's name. Nobody referenced the file directly. But the language in their communications made the fear obvious. Burkina Faso may be reconsidering compliance with established pricing frameworks. That sentence, sterile, vague, and carefully constructed, was the first sign of panic. Why? Because refusing a contract is one thing. Proving how the system works is something entirely different. Meetings were quickly scheduled in Brussels, Paris, Geneva, and Washington. Not public summits, but closed-door briefings involving trade officials, IMF-linked economists, and financial risk analysts. The topic never appeared in headlines. But the questions behind those walls were urgent. Who leaked the data? How much did Burkina Faso see? Which other African states might gain access to it? Could this trigger a pricing revolt? Was the refinery plan already connected to this discovery? They weren't worried about Burkina Faso alone. They were worried about contagion. Because once one country exposes the valuation scam, the others don't need leadership. They just need confirmation. So their first move was not confrontation. It was containment. African governments in the region began receiving polite but pointed inquiries from European trade advisors and IMF affiliates. The questions were disguised as collaboration. Are you aware of any reconsideration of pricing mechanisms in the Sahel? Have there been discussions about domestic valuation strategies? Do you anticipate any adjustment to current export agreements? But behind the soft tone was a clear intention. Find out who else was beginning to think like Traoré. At the same time, economic risk assessments were quietly drafted, warning of instability in West African mineral pricing. Because while the system scrambled to protect itself, the movement inside the Sahel had already begun shifting, not with announcements, not with speeches, but with silence and preparation. When systems like this feel threatened, they don't start with sanctions or soldiers. They start with stories, not the kind told on camera, the kind planted between the lines of respectable media, international reports, and NGO briefings funded by the very institutions benefiting from the theft. Within days of the leak reaching the wrong ears, the messaging machine activated. Articles began circulating through Western and West African media outlets with headlines that sounded concerned, not hostile. Economic stability at risk in Burkina Faso. Experts warn of gold policy miscalculations. Foreign investors seek clarity amid Sahel shifts. Military governments face resource governance questions. They thought Burkina Faso was acting alone. They were wrong. By the time foreign analysts realized what was happening, it was too late. The fire had already jumped borders. Because while the West was preparing to pressure one nation, four were already moving in silence. One, Burkina Faso controls gold. Mali controls gold and lithium. Niger controls uranium. Guinea controls bauxite and iron ore. These weren't random allies. These were states with the kind of resources that power modern empires. And they had all come to the same conclusion. Africa cannot control its future if it cannot control the price of its own wealth. And when the leaked file proved that gold was being undervalued, before export, not by mistake, but by design, the conversations between these nations stopped being ideological and became operational. No press conferences, no public declarations, just strategy. Ministers and military leaders began comparing contracts, tracing export discrepancies, and studying how gold was being reclassified once it left African soil. The numbers matched the pattern. The theft wasn't happening at the mine. It was happening on paper. And that's when the idea that terrified the West began circulating. An African metals exchange, a Sahel-built refinery network, pricing set before export, not after. This wasn't rebellion, it was replacement. So when Burkina Faso accelerated its gold refinery plans, the panic wasn't about one facility. It was about what came next. Replication. Because as soon as one nation sets its own value, the lie collapses for the rest. That's why the reaction from abroad suddenly shifted. From polite pressure to aggressive containment. Equipment deliveries were stalled. Financial transfers were delayed. Risk reports flooded newspapers. Diplomats issued warnings disguised as advice. And still, nothing stopped. The refinery became the symbol of something bigger. Africa refusing to let London and Paris decide the price of its minerals ever again. Foreign powers weren't afraid of instability. They were afraid of a system they couldn't control. A system where Africa doesn't beg for value, it assigns it. Because if Burkina Faso succeeds, Mali follows, Niger follows, Guinea follows, and the old pricing model dies. And that's why the story isn't over. It's just entering the phase they feared most. The phase where Africa stops asking and starts building. If you're one of the people who believes Africa should speak for itself, value its own gold, and write its own future, then this is your channel. Subscribe now, because the world is changing, and you won't hear this truth anywhere else.